Have you heard Thomas Sowell talk about inequality?
Yes.
What do you think about that? He sort of says that inequality is just a natural part of life. Like in the animal kingdom, you'll also find inequality, even amongst different groups of people. Why is it fair that there's one group of people who lives in a very barren
Mm,
land without much fruit and no access
yeah.
to waterways, but another set of people, they have a fruitful land and it's very dynamic, let's say.
Yeah.
So how do we actually eradicate inequality? Perhaps the pursuit of eradicating inequality can lead to our downfall.
I think the way in which, say, those kinds of naturalist approaches operate is by
Mm,
saying that, well, because it's a natural part of the animal kingdom, it means that interfering with nature is always going to be a bad thing. It's like, you're playing God. Don't play God. Leave
mm,
nature as it is. Um, sure, there are natural inequalities, but equally, what we have to recognize is that when we approach things through the development of historical lenses and sociological lenses, it's very quickly evident that forms of social inequality are not natural in the way that, say, there is a natural inequality between, say, a cheetah and an anteater in
mm,
terms of speed. Okay. Um, Part of the problem with naturalizing inequality is that it's designed to numb the capacity to be receptive to the historical and social conditions which have produced social inequality in the first place. So I think what would happen is that if, for example, we kept the naturalistic approach to inequality, we would buy into the very questionable, not necessarily absurd, because I don't want, I'm not here to be super disrespectful. I'm
mm,
I'm irreverent, but not disrespectful, I like to think. But we would buy into that very, very problematic um, kind of Milton Friedman-esque notion of the market as a kind of auto-correcting exercise.
mm.
Okay, the price signaling system will just work itself out. Just leave the market to work its own magic. Don't interfere with it. Don't use regulation. Don't do anything. It will fix itself. It will autocorrect. Um, and I think that's the problem with the naturalistic approach, is that it feeds into this idea of the market as this auto-correcting benevolent thing. But it's not. It operates through power relations. And what I think we should do is the pathway to ending inequality is, firstly, if we look at it again from a kind of global perspective, is that institutions, governments, state structures, particularly in the global north, have to come to terms with a concept which they get very defensive about, which is colonialism.
Mm.
I think the key that's going to be for equality is mass reparations, which in a way would bankrupt the world economy.
Mm.
given the amount that say the University of the West Indies total it. It's extraordinary how they actually managed to work it out, that the kind of cost of reparations for the transatlantic slavery
Mm.
trade would be in the trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
So obviously the global economy would shatter. But
Yeah.
then again, that kind of shows the scale of
Mm.
which the global economy has been structured and predicated on colonial factors and imperial domination. So that rather, even if we can't fulfill the kind of ideal promise of those kinds of reparations, being far less defensive as soon as you say, but what about the colonial heritage that this country has? Instead of being defensive about it, the conversation becomes open. And I think, like, you used a very powerful example earlier about that kind of conflict between those two formations, the Nigerian perspective and the British perspective. See, that's exactly the issue, because the idea of Britain as a colonial country, if you say this to even mainstream liberal democratic circles, they get very defensive about it. Look at the London 2012 Olympics show. It was all cool Britannia. There's nothing about what they did in terms of concentration camps for the Kikuyu people in Kenya in the 1950s, where they even reproduced the Auschwitz motto in the gates of the concentration camps. People need to be far more honest about their national histories. That's not hating the country in a way that's actually probably the most patriotic thing that you can do, because you want the country to be better. You want it to be a place of healing. You know, how else can you affect relations of equality if there is a fundamental power dynamic which excludes people's dignity from being attended to?
But I think inequality is very complex, because even when we talk about DEI, because obviously we want everyone to have the same opportunity, and even there's heavy inequalities just straight from birth, you know, just being born into a household with the parents together, you know, that have a caring education. Already that's a very inequality. But it's like, if the goal is to dunk in basketball and you put me against LeBron James, you know,
there's only one winner.
you know, I think I'll probably lose, you know?
Yeah.
Or you put me in a race against Usain Bolt, and then I train all my life, and Usain Bolt just, you know, I'll probably lose. So there's certain inequalities in the individual, even when we look at IQ, you know? Some people have low IQ, some people are born with high IQs. That it's an inequality that we can't, you know, no ideology can, no matter how good it sounds that we want to all be together, you know, we can't you know, and also it's funny, we hear this a lot, diversity is our strength, but at the same time, that same people who say that ideology also want to say, you know, we have to be equality, but diversity is our strength. There's so many moving parts, I think, with equality, and also we can ask the question, like, is equality even something we want? And what do we mean by equality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because I think there are two different concepts in play here. So you've got the notion of equality, which is very much within the kind of liberal tradition in at least the European political theoretic history of just treating everyone the same. Whereas I think the more interesting concept, which we can aim for, is equity, where with equity, what you're interested in is more about the removal of structural obstacles, which already from the get-go create relations of disadvantage. What that means is that, for example, say, like you said, in terms of university structures, if you create a racially inclusive pedagogical environment, say, you're creating a context in which students of color and white students have as much of a parity of pedagogical experience, that they have the same access to the material, the same learning outcomes, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, if then, despite having the same opportunities afforded to them, and there's the support structures also are in place, that there's no barriers to participation or anything like that. If people don't perform to the perfect standard, you could kind of say it's on them. But I think equity is the kind of key issue, because, like you said, we aren't able to eliminate all forms of basic, you know, structural differences. Like you said, you know, if I'm up against LeBron James, I would need a step ladder, a pogo stick, God knows what other accoutrement, just to kind of even attempt to kind of block him as he's kind of shooting for three, etc. But you could say, at least I'm given those tools, so it's a level playing field. And if I don't shoot the basket, I don't shoot the basket. But I can't then say, oh, you know, the reason why was because I was actually part of a, you know, colonial imperial structure that was alienating me. I think creating those environments where we give everyone as much of an opportunity to realize their talents. It's very much rooted in that kind of capabilities approach. So if you are creating contexts in which these people are just able to exercise their capacities to their best abilities, if there are going to be differences in academic performance or in productive efficiency, in terms of, say, if you're having a kind of sales company doing this, then that's fine. It's just that you have to make sure that as the provider, you're just constantly attending to the dynamics of structure and balance, and you want to create as much of a level playing field as possible.
Right.
So even if you can't achieve it, it's at least something to aim for.
So you think it's all about as long as we aim to get equity, we're in the right place.
I think very much, not just simply aiming at equity. I think even when we look at examples, say that, you yourself, Alexandra, you said, diversity is our strength. There's a lot of box ticking with equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think what happens is that when you move from EDI discourse to then DEI discourse, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's a kind of paradigm shift. Because you don't just think of diversity as saying, oh, look, we have 4 people of color in our leadership team. Aren't we doing so well? It's more about saying, well, actually, you could have 4 people of color, you could have a majority of folk of color in the leadership team, but the kind of whiteness of the space is such that it's just reproducing cultures of whiteness itself. So it's not actually changing anything. It's just all you're doing is kind of expanding the field of power, that you're getting more people of color to buy into it. What rather you want to do with aiming for equity is to say, actually, rather than having any kind of top-down discourse where we're letting you into this space, or to use an expression that I always hear all the time, we're giving you a seat at the table. It's like, it's not a kind of gift. Like, oh, hello, would you like some equality? Come sit down. It's not a handover. It's not a gift that I'm giving you. Fanon always talks about the idea of, at least in the post-colonial, decolonial context, of Black folk having to take their freedom, to demand their freedom, rather than simply wait for the beneficent practices of white folk. So I think that's why what the DEI space does is that it creates far more impetus for collaboration and for critical reflection, and enables also much better relationships of allyship as well. Because allyship isn't then just simply, oh, look, I've got 2 Black friends. I voted for Obama. Look how progressive I am. Allyship becomes something far more serious, that you are someone who can be trusted in assisting the dismantling of white supremacy, of cis normativity, of transphobia, queerphobia, etc.